my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and I am adjunct voice faculty at NYU Steinhardt in New York City. Thank you so much for tuning into my session, Wholehearted Teaching, bringing a different kind of science into the studio, which is part of the International Congress of Voice Teachers Conference in Vienna 2022. Before I get started, I want to let you know that all of my presentation slides are available on my website, which you will find, there's a QR code that has just popped up somewhere, I don't know, to the left or right of me. You can check that out there. There are some other resources there as well that I hope you'll take advantage of. I hope that gives you permission to just kind of take a breath and sit back and sit down your tablet or your pencil and just be here with me as I share what I'm so excited to share with you. A couple of years ago, I was working with a private client and I gave them a minor adjustment to a phrase they were singing. After I did that, they glared at me. And after a second, they said, you know, you don't have to be so nice. You can tell me I suck. I know I do. I was stunned into silence. And the first thing I thought was, what narrative has this singer chosen to accept about their voice, and who created, or at the very least, amplified that message? 20 years earlier, I was in a similar place. I was a student in a graduate vocal program that was political and toxic to music making. I graduated with the silent but insidious message that perhaps I shouldn't sing in public. And so without a constitution to contradict it, I embraced that narrative. And for over 15 years, I struggled with chronic sinus infections anytime I had to perform in public. There were mornings I literally would wake up with no voice. It took me years to undo the underlying narrative that kept me from singing. As teachers, we concern ourselves with the latest pedagogical developments to benefit our students, and rightly so. We must, however, also continue exploring the ways of communicating that knowledge in the studio. This is especially important to understand because, as has already been illustrated for us, how we learned is not how today's student learns. It's important in the midst of long overdue conversations about equity and inclusion, and it's important because our words and actions matter, perhaps more profoundly than we could ever know. In the next 20 some odd minutes, I will share with you some thoughts about how we can make our voice studios safer places of learning for our students, using research as our guide. In particular, I want to talk about how curiosity, vulnerability, mindfulness, and self-care can transform our studios and our students' lives. Teaching requires us to be endlessly curious. Researchers at the University of California, Davis discovered that curiosity primes the brain for learning material of interest to the student and incidental material, both with long-lasting effects. In addition to finding increased activity in the hippocampus, which aids in the consolidation of information, they were able to prove that dopamine was released in the brain when subjects were curious, eliciting pleasure during the learning event. As voice teachers, we thrive on sharing the knowledge that we have about the voice with our students and sparking their curiosity. But what about what we don't know? Michael Smithson, who is a social scientist at Australian National University, used this analogy to explain the relationship between knowledge and ignorance. The larger the island of knowledge grows, the larger the shoreline where knowledge meets ignorance extends. The more we know, the more we can ask. Questions don't give way to answers as much as they proliferate together. Answers breed questions. Curiosity isn't merely a static disposition, but rather a passion of the mind that is ceaselessly earned and nurtured. In his study, The Power Game, Power Dynamics Between the Teacher and the Students in a Graduate Seminar, researcher Gahan Sidki explains that it is often perceived or real pressures of an institution's expectations that may keep teachers and students from going against the current and trying out new methods for fear of failure. So the question is, are we willing to subvert the natural power dynamics of the student-teacher relationship in favor of helping students stay curious about what they don't know? And how can we model that kind of curiosity we want our students to practice? Let us consider the following opportunities for exploring curiosity in the studio. First, maintain an active research practice to deepen the experience of what we understand and be open to what we do not know. By immersing ourselves in different kinds of learning opportunities and sharing our findings, we signal to our students that learning is a lifelong vocation. Encourage students to be curious about their own singing experience. In a 2013 Journal of Singing article entitled "Improve Your Students' Learning by Improving Your Feedback," Lynn Maxfield explained that feedback timing has been shown to have a significant impact on the acquisition and retention of new motor skills, such as those being trained in the studio. He also explains that delayed feedback of approximately 3 seconds following completion of the task seems to be the most beneficial to a student's ability to retain new motor skills. This highlights the benefit of pausing for a moment and then allowing the student to first reflect on their experience. It can help them develop a better kinesthetic awareness of their singing and also digest technical concepts faster. It also teaches us how a student processes information. Finally, ask students if there are particular intersections of identity they would like to celebrate through the repertoire you choose together. I want to acknowledge the discomfort that may come from even suggesting such an approach. The question becomes, however, what is most affirming to the student? Inviting them to share their lived experience, should they feel comfortable to do so, or relying on our own perceptions of a student's identity and running the risk of assigning repertoire that causes harm? Asking a student to share their intersections of identity also teaches them to celebrate their individuality and advocate for themselves. The National Center of Learning Disabilities states, as more education reform efforts prioritize student voice and choice, it is essential to ensure that all learners have the opportunity to practice agency, especially within personalized learning systems. My fantastic colleague, Brian Kramer, who is the Associate Program Director of the Musical Theater Program at Elon University, created this list of questions when discussing repertoire with a student. How would this character, song, or role relate to your lived experience in a way you'd wish to examine? How would putting work into this role or piece allow you to explore your artistry, identity, and/or history? And how would this role or piece support your learning goals? Curiosity inspires. It keeps us malleable. And that's where great teaching and learning can thrive. Teaching curiosity requires us to be vulnerable. In her book, Rising Strong, researcher Dr. Brené Brown defines vulnerability as not winning or losing. It's the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. To be clear, this does not include indiscriminate oversharing. Vulnerability is the essence of improvisation. It's leaving room for what may come. Historically speaking, the master-apprentice model of teaching did not leave room for vulnerability. In this age of student-centered learning, however, we are seeing much more research emerge about the power of vulnerability. Dr. Shannon Huddy explains, true knowledge is intertwined with vulnerability because to learn something new, a learner must face uncertainty and the idea of not knowing something to be open to taking in a new perspective or new information. Through her 2-stage factor analysis and interviews with instructors, Dr. Huddy made a direct correlation between the emotional vulnerability of instructors and their students' perceived ability to learn and attain greater academic achievement. Huddy cites 3 main contributors to teachers' success. The teacher is personable. The teacher shares real-life stories, sometimes ones that are less than favorable. And the teacher creates a safe environment, allowing students to have a voice. Putting ourselves in a place of vulnerability, however, may have its consequences. Australian researchers Elizabeth Malloy and Margaret Bierman explain, the tension between vulnerability and seeking credibility creates a challenge for learning and teaching. Teachers who put themselves in a place of vulnerability potentially expose their fallibility. This subverts the power dynamic discussed earlier and leaves the teacher open to judgment and even threat. Malloy and Bierman later state, one means of embracing this tension between expressing vulnerability and appearing credible is intellectual candor, an improvisational expression of doubts, thoughts, and problems with the dual purpose of learning and promoting others' learning. Educators' revelations of inner struggles are proposed as a means of inviting reciprocal vulnerability. This builds trust and a platform for learning, particularly of the transformative nature. This leads us to some thoughts about how we can bring vulnerability into the studio. First, share personal experiences of success and failure, as outlined by Dr. Huddy's research. American psychologist Carl Rogers reflects, "I have found that the very thing which has seemed to me most private, most personal, and hence most incomprehensible by others, has turned out to be an expression for which there is a resonance in many other people. It has led me to believe that what is most personal and unique in each one of us is probably the very element which would, if it were shared or expressed, speak most deeply to others. This has helped me to understand artists and poets who have dared to express the unique in themselves." Next, celebrate quote-unquote mistakes made by the student and yourself as a natural evolution in the process of finding an authentic sound. It is inevitable that a particular vocal warm-up or exercise will not yield the desired results. So when we move on without discussion of that, the student may feel as if they have failed. Our ability to address our own adjustments of approach in the studio will help the student do the same in the practice room. As my fantastic colleague, Dr. Erin Millard, who is the head of choral studies at Florida International University, always says, "The only mistake you can make is not being prepared." Next, regularly embrace the vulnerability of singing through private or public performance. If we are adequately to recall the feelings of being wholly unmoored by the learning process, we must regularly put ourselves in similar postures of learning, whether that be through private voice lessons or workshops or public performances. For my part, I decided I had to stop hiding from behind the piano. So this past June, I performed my first solo show in 20 years, and I stayed healthy doing it. It was a momentous experience, and I can tell you I will not wait that long to do it again. And finally, we need to ask ourselves, how am I able and willing to prioritize my student comfort over my own? The performing arts industry is slowly taking steps to create more equity and inclusion, centering a diverse array of voices so that more people can not only see themselves represented, but know that they are worthy of appreciation. That said, our industry is moving far too slow. Our institutions must be an active part in this change. So what does that look like for us? Maybe it's having a conversation with your department about casting practices, allowing students to share who they feel they could embody in the world of an opera or musical without relying on casting by type, which has historically marginalized people of many intersections of background and identity. Maybe it's pooling pedagogical and repertoire resources with our colleagues in support of transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive artists. Maybe it's taking time to explore campus resources that are available to a neurodiverse student and advocating with them if that support is lacking. Maybe it's educating ourselves about our own biases and then creating a statement of inclusion that is then embedded in our syllabuses. The great thing is that there are so many different paths to equity. So again, I ask us to consider, how am I able and willing to prioritize my students' comfort over my own? This question is purposefully worded to acknowledge that we as voice teachers are sometimes just as disenfranchised. I want to acknowledge here my privilege as a white, cisgender, male-identifying teacher, and I want to ask you to simply consider accessing your vulnerability to move this conversation forward in a way that is meaningful to you and your students. Parker Palmer suggests that teaching is a daily exercise in vulnerability. That vulnerability, when expressed by us, has the potential to free students and, in the end, liberate their audiences. Being vulnerable requires us to practice mindfulness. This past semester, I was preparing my student Caleb for his master's voice recital. Caleb was kind enough to recount an interaction we had during his lesson that was a teaching moment for me.
So a couple months ago, when David and I were working on a new song from Porgy and Bess for my recital, it was the first time that we were working with a new accompanist. And it was the first couple minutes, 5 minutes of tackling the song. And there was a lot of issues with notes and rhythms, which led to
Yeah, I think I said to you something along the lines of, I don't know if this is the best use of our time right now, given that we have your pianist. Why don't we take a look at this when you know it better? And as soon as I said that, I could just see that I had wounded you. And it honestly, Caleb, it kind of haunted me the rest of the week. And I broached the subject with you, I think, at your next lesson. And I asked you what was going on. Can you share that?
Yes, and looking back at it, I'm just so thankful that you brought it up because I remember that it was something that hurt me quite a bit in the sense of I can tell that there were so many external factors that were causing like the decline of the piece as it went on because I was so used to just practicing the piece in a specific way. And
Yeah.
I don't think I'd ever mindfully focus on the specifics of the piece. So then in communicating that, the rhythms of it and the flow of it, with the first time of me singing this piece for you and with the first time of me performing with a new pianist all in one, it just was a completely negative snowball effect that just led to a showcase of an unprepared performance, even though I knew that I had prepared way more than what was being showcased in that moment.
Yeah. So I'll say to you now what I said to you then, and that is, I'm sorry that I made an assumption about your preparedness, and um, I honestly was not very mindful in that moment, and I let my own anxiety about your recital, because teachers get anxious about their students' recitals. I let my own anxiety um, get in the way, and I made assumptions about where you were in your process rather than kind of asking you. And so that was a really great teaching moment for me. And so I thank you for the grace you offered me to kind of have that conversation. I really appreciate that. I do not need to tell you that we chose a particularly stressful vocation. We must learn how to develop a sustainable way for regulating our thoughts, emotions, and behavior so we can prevent moments like the one I had with Caleb. In his book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, John Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. The practice of mindfulness, of course, has been most highly referenced as a tool for stress reduction, but it has many other positive results for the teacher and, by extension, the student. A compilation of research essays entitled Impacting Teaching and Learning, Contemplative Practices, Pedagogy and Research in Education suggests some important benefits. First, it minimizes the transition from self to other. One of the most common and difficult transitions that teachers make is moving from concerns about the self, such as a focus on self-adequacy, to concerns about the student. When we are mindful, we keep the focus on the student, not our desire to control particular outcomes. Next, it affords us an opportunity to develop reflective teaching. For instance, mindful reflection may allow a teacher to notice the early somatic, cognitive, and emotional indicators of frustration or impatience. And most importantly, mindfulness helps us maintain connection to our humanity. Remaining connected to our humanity automatically gives singers permission to fully express their artistry through their own humanity. Here are some thoughts about how we can bring mindfulness into our teaching practice. First, find a meditation practice that works for you. Tara Brach is a Buddhist psychologist and mindfulness meditation teacher. Through her work, she has created the Rain of Self-Compassion, which you will find under my recommended resources slide at the very end of this presentation. RAIN stands for recognize what is going on, allow the experience to just be there, just as it is, again, non-judgmentally, investigate with interest and care, and nurture with self-compassion. I found this a very helpful meditation practice in my teaching. Next, journaling. In a 12-week trial of general medical patients, researchers discovered that participants who took part in positive affect journaling, that is, an emotion-focused self-regulation intervention, found less depressive symptoms and anxiety after 1 month and greater resilience after the first and second month relative to their usual care. Next, be curious about any resistance you may feel while teaching. The Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute states, resistance fundamentally means you're saying to the world, I don't like it the way it is. However, the world is exactly the way it is, which means the more you resist, the more unhappiness you create. Accepting things the way that they are will not only allow you to enjoy life more, it also helps you facilitate change. And finally, try not to take things so personally. Oh, good Lord, that is easier said than done. Believe me, I know. But even if a student or colleague does something that is designed to provoke or harm us, we can operate from a place of centeredness and continue to set healthy boundaries for ourselves. Practicing mindful teaching leaves room for the student to be exactly where they are at any given moment and gives us an opportunity to speak to them from that place. If we are mindful, we must regularly practice self-care. Scoville and Trotter Matheson, the authors of The Resilient Practitioner, explain, in the theater of life, the other becomes the illuminated part of the stage. Our I is often outside the illumination. The lives of others, their hopes, ideas, goals, aspirations, pains, fears, despair, anger are in focus. Like a leaf under a microscope, we see all of this in highly illuminated detail. Out of the illuminated microscope, we can easily lose sight of our own needs. We even lose sight of the need to not respond to all needs around us. Given the personal relationships we develop with our students, it is essential for us to recognize that we are susceptible to secondary traumatic stress, STS, or vicarious trauma, VT, which essentially means that we are exposed to what our students' lived experiences are, whether they are said or unsaid. Sometimes used interchangeably, STS and VT can occur in professionals who work in high stress and high trauma exposed fields, but it can also affect civilians who do not work in high trauma fields, but are deeply impacted by stories they are exposed to. As teachers, we are highly empathic individuals, which means that we are more prone to what is known as compassion burnout. In her book, Trauma Stewardship, Laura Vandernoot Lipsky writes, many of us are familiar with living in our heads, depending on our intellect and developing enough external architecture to function and get by. But if we are to truly care for ourselves in a sustainable way, let alone anyone else, if we are to thrive, then something greater is required of us. We must discover an awareness of what allows us to live moment by moment from a centered place, from an awakened heart. We can practice self-care each day in the following ways. First, avoid centering your identity on your work. Vandernoot Lipsky writes, many people get hooked on being involved in others' lives, solving their problems, becoming a powerful figure for them, getting increasingly attached to the feeling of being needed and useful. We need to acknowledge the value of what we bring without making our work be all about us. Again, find a meditation practice that works for you. Psychiatrist, researcher, and educator Bessel van der Kolk notes in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, if we are aware of the constant changes in our inner and outer environment, we can mobilize to manage them. But we can't do this unless our watchtower, the MPFC, that's medial prefrontal cortex, learns to observe what is going on inside us. This is why mindfulness practice, which strengthens the MPFC, is a cornerstone of recovery from trauma. Next, go outside or bring the outside in. There is mounting evidence from dozens and dozens of researchers that nature has benefits for both physical and psychological human well-being. You can boost your mood just by walking in nature, even in urban nature. Of course, sometimes our teaching schedules do not actually allow us to go outside during the day, but researchers have discovered that even simulated nature in the form of 360-degree nature videos and virtual reality have benefits. In lieu of such expensive virtual devices, I recommend to you Find the Lizard on Instagram and Twitter, which was created by herpetologist Dr. Erin McGee. Or maybe consider buying some plants for your home or your studio. They help too. And finally, let's maintain a sense of humor, dear God. There's little that helps us to hit the reset button faster and better than humor. And to that end, I offer you this ridiculousness.
Now listen, try this. Ah, ah, oh, ah, e, ha, ha, I will.
I'm interested in science. And science is now telling us that curiosity, vulnerability, mindfulness, and self-care matter. We must listen. That does not mean we disregard what we know in favor of this new information. No, it means that we expand our island of knowledge and ignorance to grow with the changing times. I will be the very first to admit that I do not operate from such a grounded place all the time, as was evidenced by my conversation with Caleb. But we can fail better, moving ourselves forward every day. Dr. Brené Brown reminds us, what we know matters, but who we are matters more. Let me say that in a different way. What you know is important, but who you are is more important. I hope we can use that as our framing device as we continue to learn together, because I believe that when we do, the power that we extend to our students is so far beyond our own. This balance of head and heart, intellect and humanity, which is at the very center of transformative singing, is it not? It is what we venerate in performers, right? Setting healthy boundaries, absolutely, but still remaining vulnerable. Quieting our minds so we can perceive the process of another, taking care of ourselves so we can create safer spaces where our students can learn and try and fail and soar. For me, that is what wholehearted teaching is. And what a privilege, right? What a privilege. Thank you so much for your time.